Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 40 of Podcast vs. Enemies, a Destiny Massive Breakdown show. It's good to be back with the full gang this week as we wind down Season 19. We're going to be keeping it relatively brief today as we take a look back at our developer interview, but before we jump into that, we want to take a moment to thank a few people. Court?
Hello, Saint. Nice to hear you again. We don't have any reviews or any sort of feedback this week, but I would like to remind our listeners that if you'd like to give us any feedback, whether that's praise or critique, with our Q&A stroke interview with Vivian Bex and Chris Proctor, we're all ears, just for potential improvements for future Q&As and interviews. Nothing to announce here, but just to, I think the general feedback that we've received has been quite high, good. So if you've got any sort of extended praise or critique you'd like to offer us, then we're all ears. Speaking of which, you can send us any feedback over on our socials, which we'll list at the end of the episode, or via the Destiny Massive Breakdowns Discord server. Of course, positive, critical, and constructive feedback does help with the trajectory of the podcast and how we present and break down builds, activities, and much more in the PV sandbox for both the established Destiny players and new lights. So don't hesitate to reach out if you've got questions or ideas for builds. We're all happy to talk Destiny. We do use Chartable to aggregate our podcast reviews, but this may take some time for our non-US listeners for their reviews to appear. Alternatively, you can just send us your review on any of our socials. We also want to extend a special thank you and appreciation to everyone that supports PvE, whether that is downloading and listening to our show, discussing it on the Discord server, or supporting us via Patreon. Pass you over to Impetus for our show outline.
Hello, lads. Yes, we are doing a review, a commentary, a react to the episode 38 interview with Vivian Bex and Chris Proctor. Just touching on the highlights from that Q&A. We wanted to wait until Saint came back before we did that, so this is why it's an episode off from when we actually recorded it. We also do want to take some time here to just give a heads up about our schedule for our American listeners. Obviously, Thanksgiving is coming up, so we'll be taking next week off as I travel to go celebrate Thanksgiving with my extended family, and then the weekend after Thanksgiving, we will come back and wrap up the season, talk about Season 19 as it's winding down, give our thoughts on Arc 3.0, and looking forward to Season 20 before we go off again for Christmas and the winter festivities. All right, so now we're going to head into what we did in Destiny 2 last week, or what we did out of Destiny 2 last week for some of us. I'll start things off here. I finally checked off a bucket list item that I've had in Destiny for a while, and I soloed a GM. So this past week we had the Devil's Lair Nightfall up, and I did it on Arc Hunter and Arc Titan. Probably hoping to do it on Arc Warlock either tonight or tomorrow night before it goes away for the season. So it was a lot of fun, good challenge, had a blast. It took me 5 tries on each Hunter and Titan. Yes, some of those were due to error codes that don't need to be named, but overall it was a very, very fun experience. I used Arbalest, the Under Your Skin Void Bow, and Sales by Pitch class, and had a great time doing it. Hope to do more of them from season to season as they become available. It's a very fun challenge. I figured since I do GM so much in a fire team, I might as well give it the old college try by myself. So, Court, what have you been doing in Destiny?
Not a lot. I will just say I think Devil's Lair is probably one of the better GMs to do solo if you want to go in first time, or if you've maybe done a few solo GMs before. It's got a nice healthy balance. I did, I think maybe not last time it showed, but the previous time Devil's Lair showed up, and it's a nice healthy balance with the ad density and the sort of general difficulty. So if you're keen to do any sort of solo...
You telling me I got to go solo this GM now? I feel like now you've both done it. I can't.
Well, I haven't done it recently.
My thumbs at the tower.
Okay. Oh, it's okay.
I haven't done it
I've
recently.
I've only done
one.
Yeah.
But yeah, no. Speaking of Solo Flawless, I do plan to do a little bit of those dungeon runs. I think this is the best time to do it. You know, you're high power, you've got all your artifacts unlocked, and all the seasonal stuff that you've been chasing, hopefully up to level. So I do want to go into a few of those dungeons, especially on Arc Hunter, just with that's now, you know, it's the season of Arc, so it makes sense to do so. Outside of Destiny, though, I have been playing a lot of Modern Warfare 2, 2022. I played the original, so I have not been playing the original Modern Warfare 2, but I have been playing Modern Warfare Roman numerals 2.
Yes, there you go.
It's Modern Warfare 22. Okay?
I've been calling it MW22. A lot of fun. Mostly been playing with a few IRL friends and a few from like extended communities, and it's, you know, I think it's just another great social game. So yeah, let me know what you think of it, if you've been playing, any listeners that have been playing, and what your favorite weapons and setups are. I would like to try a few of those kind of weird and wacky setups, a bit like what we see with Destiny. Yeah, Saint, what have you been up to?
I've had a busy few weeks. I got married on the 30th. And it was great. Everything, you know, went off without a hitch. Wedding was smooth. And been on my honeymoon. We went to Washington State, which was great. Spent some time in Seattle for a bit, and then went out to Olympic and Rainier National Parks. I even got to meet up with a clanmate of mine, Saint Cephalopod, who I've known for years and years, and we went out to dinner with him and his wife. So that was really cool, kind of Destiny meets IRL moment there, getting to hang out with them. And they bought us dinner. You know, what a guy, what a stand-up guy there, Saint Cephalopod. Hope you hear that one. Since I got back, I ran a couple of GMs trying to get a Silicon Aroma with basically snap opening and like a lot of handling and/or stability for the Crucible, and just farming some golf balls because it was double GM or double Nightfall loot, so it's like, you know, double golf balls and exotics every run, which is great. And also been playing a little Modern Warfare 2.22, you know, and enjoying that. The some of the weapon systems in there are, like, maybe it's good, but I'm not sure. It's a bit convoluted. I don't know how I feel about that yet, but it's different for sure. So I'll give them that. They're trying something new. Don't know how that's going to land, but we'll stick to Destiny for this episode. This is not Modern Warfare breakdowns for now. So let's jump into kind of episode 38 and all the stuff that we got. Let's get meta. You know, let's break down an interview, a breakdown. You know,
Yeah.
I think off the bat we got, I mean, a couple origin trait questions, right? Where a few early ones, some interesting stuff there.
Yes, Court, I know you have some thoughts on the origin traits. I'll let you start here.
Well, I was going into this thinking, you know, not a lot of people talk about origin traits or Foundry traits. So I was thinking, you know, the community aren't going to latch onto this. But boy, I was wrong. The amount of discussion outside, like in the general Destiny community regarding origin traits and Foundry traits, and talking about, we might hear about XYZ Foundry coming back, was quite surprising. And yeah, like I said, I'm surprised that people have latched on to this particular topic. But I suppose it's an interesting one because there are some really good weapons that were unfortunately sunset, especially when it comes to the Season of Dawn weapons, which I think were the biggest, like the most egregious example of weapons that got unfairly sunset, because you've got some really solid ones in there, like Line in the Sand and Breachlight, where like, and you had the original Waveframe as well. Mm-hmm. Like those weapons, I would love to come back, but we did get the sort of the big caveat of, you know, the weapons team want to bring it back as well, but it has to follow the Like there has to be a seasonal beat, there has to be a story beat. It doesn't make sense just to, chuck us a load of kindled orchids and breach lights when it doesn't make sense. And yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, what do you guys think of?
I mean, I think they mentioned that it started off as Foundry traits, which was super interesting. That they just made traits for like the core 4 Foundries, and that was going to be how they set those apart. And then it kind of it just grew and grew and grew from there. And it really can shape a weapon. You mentioned Under Your Skin and your solo GM, which is such a good weapon. I mean, it's a good weapon off of its kind of your base, what you would assume. Its frame is good. Its stats are pretty good. It's craftable and has, you can get Archer's Tempo, an Explosive Head, and all these.
That's what I had.
Bow perks. But
fantastic.
That land tank trait just gives you that extra little bit of like, not, it's like it is like a full perk of its own. They said originally half perk, but I'm like, man, extra DR and resilience from land tank is kind of big, man. So yeah, I'm loving origin traits, and I think that I'm really glad that it grew beyond Foundry traits, right?
Yeah, it's I guess it. I mean, I feel like I see posts either on Twitter or Reddit always about asking for old weapon groups to come back and stuff. But it definitely seems like the origin trait discussion, or comments rather, from Chris have stoked a fire in the community regarding other stuff. And I mean, of course, all three of us are really excited to see what the new Foundry traits that are coming out in the next few seasons will be, beyond, the dungeon that's coming next season, the seasonal stuff, the raid, the Neomuna destination origin trait that'll be on those weapons. But the speculation is certainly running rampant, as Chris encouraged. So we'll see if we can get Black Armory. That's obviously the one that I'm looking forward to the most. I love the look of those weapons. I got all of the original rolls back when I started playing in Season of Arrivals, but I had to immediately delete them because I knew that they weren't going to be able to be infused up come Beyond Light's release. So I would love to have all those weapons again, proper crafted with an origin trait. But I mean, sure, there's going to be other batches that I want back to. I won't say no to any of that stuff because I didn't get a chance to really play with those weapons. So for me, it's all new content, and I'm looking forward to it. Even though some people in the community won't see it that way, which is understandable. But origin traits definitely help with making them feel new. The menagerie weapons definitely do perform differently with that origin trait. Getting that strength and discipline can be really nice if you get one of those stats, particularly discipline. I think is the more popular one. If you're sitting at tier 8 discipline, you can't squeeze any more stats out of your armor or mods. That origin trait, having that full super, getting your discipline all the way up to that tier 10 can be really helpful for pushing your build to that next level. So it definitely wasn't something that we were thinking about with the original batch of menagerie weapons. So I'm excited to see what a Black Armory, or what we know the Deepstone Crypt, origin trait will be next season. It's very exciting to see how these weapons get pushed in a new direction, aside from the perk refresh, which is also coming alongside with these returning weapons.
I'm going to ask both of you a question. Is what weapon foundry would you like to come back? Like, what's your preferred out of Black Armory, or like a generic one like Cassoid or Vex Mechanica?
I think that Crux Lomar is like so ethereal at the moment. It is such a little detail known about it. I mean, like, we've seen kind of their work, but it's very polished, but it's very different. Like if you look at like Truth is from them, right? And Truth is a very interesting weapon because it's like the Black Armory weapons are very like geometric and sleek, right? And Truth is like, it's futuristic, but it's also like a bit strange looking, right? And I like that. I think Truth is kind of a weird gun, and I would love to see more. Like I would love to see Crux Lomar, like legendary heavy weapons or something like that would be kind of like a left field pick for me.
Yeah, I mean, Cassoid is definitely, I think, on my mind right now just because of a certain a certain weapon dominating in trials this weekend from that Foundry. It's an exotic weapon, so it wouldn't get the Foundry trait. But yeah, Cassioid makes some weird stuff, and I definitely want to see what legendary Cassioid weapons would look like with an origin trait. What about you, Court? What would you want back?
I mean, everyone keeps talking about Black Armory, and it's a really solid choice. But if I could make a choice between Black Armory and, say, the Season of Dawn weapons, that's not strictly a Foundry, but it's a seasonal set of weapons. I think I would more desire Season of Dawn weapons, just because we never got much use and utility out of those weapons. They were a victim of Sunset, the highest, the top tier of victims when Sunset came and destroyed them out of the game. I mean, yeah, you can still use them, but like not in any meaningful activities. So, Black Armor, yeah, solid choice. But those Dawn weapons, they just look so sleek and shiny, and I don't know, just some of them have a special place in my heart.
I'm excited. I know there's a lot of speculation around origin traits, but again, it's such an amazing. Probably, I really do think, like, looking back over this year, I think it's probably the best update we've had to weapons across the board. Crafting is certainly controversial, but I don't think origin traits are for the vast majority of the community, and they've given such wonderful dimension to a lot of weapons. I do think of the core 4 foundries, and it's like, yeah, there's a lot of weapons there that if they didn't have that origin trait, I probably wouldn't be as excited. Like, I think of Funnel Web, Subsistence Frenzy, it's a great combination, but if it didn't have that Vice Stinger, I probably would have ditched it for Unforgiven from our dungeon that we just got Duality last season.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that Unforgiven isn't a fantastic option, but the fact that I can pair both Subsistence and Frenzy with Vice Stinger really, really makes that thing shine in low-level content. It's just so much fun to be firing out a ridiculous amount of bullets. Whereas with Unforgiven, I can slay out, I can tap into Void 3.0 synergy with Repulsor Brace if I want to, or Adrenaline Junkie in a demo. So it's definitely, my vault's the fullest it's ever been, and it's really just because of those origin traits. Got so many different bases covered with them.
Now let's talk. If we're talking about the Foundry traits, another question I want to ask is: do you guys think that Amalon and Suros foundries are enough when compared to like what Hake and Vice offer, especially in like PvE? I feel like they're kind of. I mean, like personally, I will open this up by saying I feel that they are a bit weak in comparison, and Vice Stinger is probably a bit too strong. I don't know, thoughts, opinions, feelings?
It's definitely more situational. I think those are kind of probably designed for PvP in mind, and so there's certain weapons where I'll just go off of Suros. That extra handling can be really great in PvE, but it's very weapon dependent. If I'm looking at a weapon with like at least 40 handling, then I don't really care about that extra 36 handling that I get from reloading a weapon. But we have a Suros sniper rifle. I will always take more handling regardless of the sandbox that I'm in on my sniper rifles, as that lets me get my ADS up faster. It lets me swap to the weapon faster, stow the weapon faster. That can be very nice if I'm trying to use that sniper rifle for burst damage, which is the intended role in PvE. So it's not, I certainly don't think it's a waste. Like when the effect procs, I do appreciate the effect, but for primary weapons, like we don't have a Suros 120, which would be another situation where I could maybe see myself, caring about that extra handling. We do have 140s, but Cantata feels great without it. Like the handle, I don't feel like the handling on Cantata is egregious enough that I was like, oh, I got to really spec into this Suros synergy by having a reload perk so I can get to that extra handling quicker. So yeah, for me, it's just in the case of Suros, it's a little too situational in PvE. It can help, but for the most part, I'm not really thinking about it when I look at a lot of my Suros primary weapons.
Yeah, I don't think I've got in much else to add. Yeah, I suppose two of the Foundry traits are, more curated towards PvP, and then the other two are more PvE centric. Could we see more of a bonus towards the PvE sandbox for for those two. I mean, Chris has quite blatantly said on that episode that they're always open for ideas and for changing those perks. We see with the Gambit. Gambit origin traits had, the largest reworks within the origin trait system. So I think they're always keen to open up, and I think all the origin traits should have at least one, just a small utility in every sandbox. And as it stands right now, I think the only one that doesn't work within its set specific activity is the Iron Banner one. What you do for the rest of the sandbox for PvE, I'm not sure what you do for the Iron Banner one, but I think that should be at a base minimum. It should do one thing, but they seem quite keen to buff those things up and to make them more, or I should say, less restrictive for their own specific sandboxes.
Anything else we want to say about origin traits, foundries, from what Chris and Vivian were discussing?
No, it's cool to see more. I mean, I really recently, the system where we've been getting a couple weapons from each foundry each season has been great. I'm totally fine if it, instead of it's 2 weapons from 4 foundries, it's, a little more spread out to like 6 foundries or something like that. And a couple of them get 1 each and a couple of them get 2 would be great. It's just more identity, more variety.
All right, do we want to go into the Adept weapon discourse?
Oh yeah, because I mean, this is like it's kind of big, Is it enough to? I guess we should recap the response real quick, right? Part of the conversation between Adept weapons and normal weapons and their enhanced perks, they know that like the crafted enhanced weapons are just straight up better than what the Adept weapons are offering. Something that they did say that was, they were kind of surprised by how much people like wanted Adept weapons to be very meaningful in their own special thing when they were originally just going to be like the shiny version of the weapon. For those that are familiar with the Pokemon franchise, basically it just looks different, and that's the only thing that's special about it. But they announced some changes that are coming with the Lightfall raid. Court, you want to recap that one?
Yes, so they plan to add enhanced traits for those particular weapons, just to give it a little bit of a slight edge. So, yeah, as you were saying, they acknowledged that crafted versions with enhanced perks are just better than Adept weapons. And I certainly agree with that. And there's a lot of discussion, especially in our Discord, that it's this balance between should Adept weapons take the edge over crafted weapons, but still have that, you have to chase them, that they cannot be constructed, you can't go in and make them yourself, versus crafted weapons, which are, yes, you can actually physically craft them, and you can add enhanced traits. So will this change to, running the master version of a raid give you, presumably that's what's going to give you Adept perks on Adept weapons. Will that give them a slight edge? Still have to see. I think they were pretty quiet in terms of they wanted to talk about more things, but they're going to talk about that in the future when it comes to Adept weapons. But I'm really looking forward to see how this can be managed and maintained, because it is a very fluid debate everywhere. It's the crafted versions versus Adept weapons. But it was very interesting to see Chris say, look, we weren't really anticipating people would have a big draw on Adept weapons. And I was, to be honest, I was quite surprised about that, because, if you ever make an additional, like, one-up quote one-up weapon like Adept weapons, you should anticipate the community is going to latch onto that. But yeah, come to see how that will kind of balance the playing field. I think Chris also mentioned that, quote, there's definitely been power creep in the crafting system, 5 to 10% in the outliers, which we're definitely comfortable with, and that ultimately not that different from Adept weapons, which are 2 to 5% stronger than regular versions. So there's a very fine-tuned balance happening behind the scenes, and I'm really looking forward to what they do, because it's a very contentious issue. Impetus, you got any thoughts there?
Yeah, I was internally cracking up when he was given those percentages about quantifying the amount of power creep that are coming from the crafting system and the Adept weapons, because I'd be surprised if the Lightfall raid weapons have perk pools as spicy as the Kingsfall ones, especially considering what Chris has said about the Kingsfall weapon perk pools being very spicy. But I'm thinking of like we're getting another D1 raid coming back halfway through next year. It's either going to be Krotos or Wrath of the Machine. If those weapons are as spicy as Kingsfall, then presumably the Adept weapons will also have the enhanced perks. If they're anything like what Kingsfall has, that's based on the percentages that they've given, somewhere between 7 to 15% stronger than the regular craftable version of the either Wrath or Crota and raid weapons. And I'm not sure if that, when we start combining those percentages, if that suddenly gets way out of band for what they want for these weapons. I'm just thinking of the Kingsfall weapons. If the Adept Kingsfall weapons had access to the enhanced traits, there would be some very, very strong weapons that could be. I mean, I think of like Smite of Moraine with that incredible perk pool. If I could get enhanced Pugilist, enhanced Swashbuckler with enhanced Demo and enhanced Adrenaline Junkie, I'd probably never touch another Kinetic Pulse Rifle ever again. Right? They're so stacked. I do worry that we're gonna get way out of band just trying to make sure that Adept weapons feel like a chase. But at the same time, I do think we need to have a chase for these master raids. I would prefer a little bit more cosmetic stuff, but if it has to be Adept weapons from the raids, then so be it. But we started out with having Adept weapons in trials, and then that got expanded to GMs, and then it was added to the Master Vault of Glass. And so I can kind of understand why they were initially intending them to be cosmetic. Obviously, it was a different story in D1, but that was a different team that was working on the Adept weapons back then. But yeah, we have Artifice Armor in Master Dungeons, so that's not a concern. But the Master Raids, it's going to be interesting and something that we'll want to keep an eye on. But yeah, they have potential to be very, very, very strong. We certainly did see that with the Master Vault of Glass weapons. Some of them are quite powerful, just in combination of being an Adept with some really, really spicy perk pools. Yeah. It's a fine line. You definitely said it right. It's a very fine line to walk, and I do not envy the weapons team for trying to make this work and satisfy as many people as possible.
You mentioned cosmetic there, and I've seen this as well on Twitter and Reddit, is when are we going to get more mementos? I think that's a nice little cosmetic idea for, yes, okay, again, it's another crafted weapon system, but mementos on other activities, not just the 3 core, Vanguard, Trials, and Gambit. I think raid mementos would be nice to see. Yep.
Now imagine for a moment, Master Kingsfall offers a memento that makes your weapon look taken. Okay? I think people would be farming that all week.
I am currently throwing money at my microphone here.
I do like the fact that now, okay, you can craft a weapon and level it up and get its most powerful version, or you can do the Master Raid and get an equally powerful version of the game at the mercy of like RNG to an extent. But the way that if they drop with a couple perks or something like that, your odds are pretty good with these raid weapons that you're gonna get a good set. So I do like that one is deterministic and the most powerful, but it takes a long time. And the other is not deterministic, but also the most powerful, and you can go grind it, if that's what you really want to do. So I'm glad it's equitable. Agree that it's for sure some power creep, but they seem to be all right with how that is balancing out, at least in like the rest of the game. And I would still, I think the Momentous is a great note there of like I would still like to see a little bit more from like Master Raids in terms of incentives, and just more Mementos in general because of the personalization and stuff that they offer.
Yeah, I mean the extra perks thing, I didn't think to ask Chris about this when we were doing the interview, but this was the first season where if you did enough resets, you could get 3 perks in columns 3 and 4 for our ritual weapons. And I was just, the thought came to me after the interview of like, what would it look like to have an Adept raid weapon with 3 perks in columns 3 and 4? They have 7 perks in both of those columns. It's a tight perk pool. You got nothing but bangers for the most part across both of those columns. Like, I would be incentivized to go run a master raid if I knew I was getting at least half of the perk pool on a given adept weapon, even if they weren't enhanced. And so, again, we'll have to see what it's like to get an adept weapon with enhanced perks come Lightfall, what that chase is going to look like and stuff. But, I'm just wondering, like, I love the fact that the Adept raid weapons had that extra column. It started out with being the curated role for Vogue, and then it opened up to being a bit more fluid with Vow the Disciple and King's Fall. I think that's a great change. It definitely doesn't sting as much when you don't get the perfect lineup, but at least you can, it's a lot more appetizing if the barrels and the masterwork and the magazine doesn't line up. If you've got 4 bangers across those last 2 columns that you can, maybe you get a PvP and a PvE roll, or you get 2 different PvE rolls on the same gun. That can really help out. That can make the gun even more appetizing. So I'd like to see, I would just like to see what the weapons team thought about adding yet another set of perks for each of those final 2 columns, and whether or not they felt like that would have been a little bit too out of band. I mean, you can only select 1 each, but yeah.
All right. Anything else on Adepts? Yeah, I think we got that talked through. So let's talk about another very, very calm, level topic, Divinity. And the changes that they made, the changes they did not make. You kind of got some, it's discussion on where they thought about taking it and kind of how they ended up. And also the fact that there's, in updating Divinity, they also seemingly have fixed some bugs with the way that it was working previously and things like that. So I think this is a pretty good, section. Court, I know this one is near and dear to your heart. You take it away, man. Yes,
my specialist topic. I was going into this because this was one of my top questions to ask Chris, because he's talked about this before, and with the big kind of community unrest the last couple of months because of Divinity's upcoming changes from 30% down to 15%. I did see a few community suggestions of whether it applied a 0% weaken effect, which overrode every other weaken effect but still maintained its precision gauge, or it would have an alternate firing mode. And that was a very interesting answer that we did get, is that they thought it was an interesting idea, but, quote, is more fertile ground for a brand new exotic, end quote. So that really piqued my interest of maybe not anytime soon. This could be something in the far, far future, is we could have another debuff weapon, which they did go into talk about how they make the process behind debuff weapons related to, the weapons team talked to the combatants team and how Divinity would work with those combatants and how it would work, and when it comes to raids as well, they'd get a lot of feedback from all these different teams. So that was a very interesting insight. But for me personally, just seeing all these little kind of suggestions being kind of ticked off was just like, yeah, this. They went for I think a fair a fair decision here with going from 30% down to 15%. They could have been a lot more drastic. As people were suggesting magazine/ammo count. They wanted to maintain that. It's still a very utility-heavy weapon. Still one of the best overload weapons, and it's a free precision cage for your weapons that perform precision damage. So really interesting, and yeah, like I said, this particular topic is near and dear to my heart. We did also get again another question that I snuck in. Was related to Bungie's philosophy on damage stacking, which is another contentious topic discussion. And although nothing was directly confirmed, we're not getting any huge overhauls anytime soon. Chris did mention that there are going to be some smaller scaled changes. Quote, some of the bigger multipliers will have to come down a little bit, end quote. So we know directly that they are looking at damage stacking, which, for me, who maintains a spreadsheet that lists all the damage stacking and how you can damage stack, objectively, that is my spreadsheet. But when it comes to subjectively my thoughts on damage stacking, yes, I think they should go down the route of additive stacking. I'm not a big fan of putting a cap on damage stacking because I still think you should be able to build into damage stacking. We were talking about this just shortly before we started the episode, but I think Saint, you said you would also prefer that kind of additive stacking so you can actually just build into it. You got any more other thoughts?
Yeah, I just like the idea of having a lot of depth in the sandbox, and that means that, getting a 20% buff, let's say, is pretty easy. But if you want to get the full 50% buff, you've really got to build in your subclass or your team composition, right? Your exotic armor choices, your mod sets, your exotic weapons, whatever it is. So they want to keep, this kind of aspect of the game, I feel like, without getting to a point where you're dealing 450% outgoing damage because you stack together your grenade and a tractor cannon and a divinity, and a weapons of light buff or whatever it is, and now you're dealing 400% damage. So I'm totally cool with moving to additive and letting more things work with each other, more buffs work together that are giving lower percentages, because then it just promotes more team synergy.
Yeah, I think for the PvP sandbox, it would make it a lot more, a lot less of a nightmare to balance because, multiplicative stacking is a thing there. Yes, we've got smaller scaled stacking when it comes to high energy fire isn't 20%, it's 15% in PvP, and Radiant isn't 25%, it's 7.5% in PvP. So we don't have as much of a damage stacking problem in PvP, but it's still a relatively as Chris said, enormous pain in the ass. So for PvP wise, I know this isn't a PvP sandbox podcast, but I think it would make things a lot less frustrating over there. And for us in PvE, just being able to build craft, I think, is what they should really build or pivot into when it comes to Destiny. Like I said, I don't think a cap to damage stacking would be the best route. I know some folks would maybe prefer that, just to really put a limit on damage stacking so it's fair for everyone. I'm not too keen on that. But yeah, that's my thoughts when it comes to damage stacking. Impetus, you got anything you'd like to add here?
Yeah, most of my thoughts on this aren't really tied to, should it be additive? Should it be multiplicative? I don't have strong feelings either way, mostly because this is a topic that so few people in the player base really engage with in a serious manner. I mean, I definitely think this is a topic that needs to be hammered out, ironed out as well as clearly as possible. But when we were going through this section of the interview, the quote that really stood out to me was Chris saying a lot of the content in the game is built assuming that players have easy access to a 30% debuff and weaken. And this is an educational podcast. Like our job here, our target demographic is getting people more comfortable so that they can go into raids and dungeons for the first time. And he said that, and my first thought was like, well, I don't think a lot of people, I mean, that's going to be news for a lot of people, is like, oh, I'm supposed to be speccing into a bit more of a utility role rather than just raw damage, because I don't think that's the fantasy that Destiny has really sold and marketed itself on. When you think of your trailers and your promo images and stuff, it's people one-shotting every enemy in the game with, a sidearm or, slide shotgunning into a wyvern. And it's like, it looks cool for the trailer, but that is not actually how we play the game. You cannot slide shotgun into a wyvern on the Glassway GM unless you're stacking, your synthos, your tractor cannon, even then you're probably going to die most of the time. But that's a big deal. You do need to start caring about your debuffs, your weaken effects, which is part of the reason why I think all this outcry over Divinity had me chuckling. It was like, how many of you that are actually pissed about this nerf actually use Divinity, on a regular basis, or are you just getting outraged because an exotic weapon that drops from a raid that you probably don't have, is getting touched in a way, and it means that you can't put out big boy numbers anymore. Like, so few people do raids on a regular basis, right? It's less than 10% of the population has done a single raid. So while I do think that the damage stacking does need to be brought down, at the same time, we also just need to do a better job of making sure that the wider population understands how debuffs and weaken effects work. And that's not just the weapons team that's responsible for that. That is the sandbox as a whole. But it's like, okay, great. We're thinking about how to stack stuff. That's always good to hear. Let's start working ways in ways to explain how debuffs and weaken effects really matter, so that when you do start making content that's built assuming that players have this easy access to a 30% debuff weaken effect, they know that they're supposed to be bringing in that big percentage debuff weaken effect. Because I think for most of the Destiny player base, they have no idea that they're supposed to be speccing into this, and they're missing out on what's this power fantasy that we play with, that we kind of take for granted because we're aware of how this sandbox stuff works. So it's just like, I'm thinking of the New Lights when he said that. Like, they have no idea what they should be doing right now. They're just speccing into raw damage, and it's cool and it's fun and it's certainly a fantasy, but they're missing out on the power that lets you solo a GM or solo flawless a dungeon, or one phase a raid boss, because the game just doesn't explain to them why this stuff matters. And now we have to make a whole podcast explaining how this stuff matters so that they can get to that level.
My entire spreadsheet is built, or, well, not previously, but is now the center focus of damage stacking. And I completely echo your sentiments there, Impetus, where it's, we know what's damage stacking all about. And, most of the Destiny Massive Breakdowns community know what's damage stacking. But those that are maybe brand new listeners to this podcast, or, going into in-game activities, not really sure what damage stacking is all about. Even I've created a spreadsheet to show and to truncate and to, visualize how it works. But it's still very tricky to do that. For me to design an infographic, which I've been hammering my head against the wall for the last couple of months, and still unhappy of how those turn out to be, purely because the game has difficulty showing and how to explain damage stacking, and it is an important subject. If you want to do really well in XYZ content, then damage stacking is definitely up there in terms of build crafting. But how the game actually shows damage stacking and how it visualizes and explains it, and it's really tricky for me to do it, whether it's on a spreadsheet or is on an infographic, just because there's so many different categories. There's so many different versions of stacking, and this, Roaring Flames, which is an ability for Solar Hunters, Titans has a different type of stacking when it's used with Worm God Caress, but it doesn't when it's used with 1-2 Punch. I think it's the same, but there's different variations, and it's really complicated to get down into that, rabbit hole. So, sorry, that's my mini rant there.
Well, I was going to say, speaking of like communication to the player, right, and how people come to understand things in a game, I'm just going to segue right into a phrase that I believe Vivian used, which was gameplay grammar. And this was in the conversation around all the 3.0 verbs in the 3.0 system. The initial question was kind of like, what was the shift into all these like weapon perks that have sandbox interactions? And basically this kind of started coming into focus with stasis in 3.0, and then eventually Headstone, right, I believe was like the very first elemental tie-in perk, and then it's just really gone crazy from there. And they said that one of the reasons they have been able to do this, or like, it's a little bit easier, is because the same verb, like your subclass 3.0 verbs, are working the same way across wherever you're seeing them in the game on the different classes, and in your scorch from your weapons, or your scorch from your grenade is functionally the same thing. And basically how that kind of allows them to make slightly more complicated things without having to do as much of explaining, because of the consistency that like the shared aspects and the shared functionality between the abilities in 3.0 and the weapon perks in 3.0 are. And yeah, it's great. I think that also, they were talking about the fact that this partially came from like the technology with all the stuff that was coming from the 3.0 systems, and that like the wording even just of these verbs like helped aid in the creation of all these perks. And another one that I wanted to bring up, a really interesting one that was a little bit later on, was about the verbs that we currently have and kind of where all the different perks have landed. They said that there's some new elemental perks coming in Lightfall, and they've also said that there's no verb out of all of the 3.0 sandboxes, whatever, all the different elements, light and dark, that is like off the table or could never be a weapon perk. So, I think that some of these are obviously very risky. Like they mentioned volatile, or not volatile, suppression, right? Was the one where he's like, yeah, suppression is great, but like you put suppression on a gun and put it in the crucible, like that's a nightmare zone for anybody that is dying near this player and instantly getting suppressed constantly. That is like super toxic. So there's for sure a fine line to walk on like what can be strong in PvE and what can not totally be oppressive in PvP. But it's real interesting to hear that pretty much anything was on the table. So I guess follow up on this one is, what you guys are going to create a weapon perk of choice that can use any 3.0 verb. How would you use it?
Oh man,
that is a very interesting question. I would have prepared an answer. Okay. I think Stasis has got some really good ones, because the often forgotten about one is the Sword's Cold Steel perk, which applies slow stacks. So I'm thinking, we've already got, what's the one that rolls on special weapons?
You thinking Chill Clip?
Yeah, Chill Clip. That's another really good one. But a new one. Do you have one, Saint, while we think of a perk?
Mine is kind of like, well, I got two options for you here. We have a rework of Unrelenting, which gives a burst of cure on multi-kill, right? That would be this is okay. Just kind of a thought for like team play, right? Yeah, I don't know. That's my And then I guess what was the other one we were going to talk about? We talked about Cold Steel, and then I was like, my mind immediately went to, what if we put that like on a glaive, or we made, chill clip like a dragonfly type of explosion. To when you get a kill, it chills enemies around it. So it's kind of like a version of incandescent and chill clip combined. I don't know, there's a couple. None of this is real, by the way, just to be very clear. This is all just completely ramblings here. None of this is happening in game.
None of these are confirmed. We are not Bungie developers.
Right.
Yeah, Saint can't talk about the perks. He's already gotten to play with it, Bungie. So.
I can tell you this much: those are not real. Those ones are totally just my made-up fantasies of what I want to see someday.
Yeah, MisterSudden, can you cut this last part out here?
Is listening to this one? Vivian tuning in? Chris, anybody?
Didn't hear? Hello. I'll talk about my perk, because I do have one that when Void 3.0 came out, I was lamenting about the fact that like they divvied up a lot of those elemental perks to the subclasses on the abilities front. And the one that I'm thinking of is I would love to tap into Invis on a legendary weapon for the Titans and the Warlocks. Obviously, again, very, very problematic in PvP. Obviously, we're having a certain Hunter exotic armor that's tearing it up right now with overshields, but Hunter Void Kit is certainly very strong, and giving them yet another access to Invis that they could maybe then stack with this exotic that gives them an overshield would be problematic. But I do want to play with Invis on my Void Warlock and my Void Titan, and I would absolutely love to, if it requires me to use an ability to get that back or something, like if there's an osmosis like trigger to get that Invis, I would still be very interested in getting Invis on a weapon, just so I can play into that fantasy, so I can build into that fantasy on my Void 3.0 Warlock and Titan, because that is a very fun aspect of the sandbox, the ability sandbox, and I want to tie into it a little bit more on my non-hunter characters.
For me, now, they mentioned suppression. I'm going to have sort of two answers here, but they with similar vein. So Arc Blind and Suppression from the Void Sandbox, I think, are two extremely powerful sandbox verbs, effects. And I'm just looking at my spreadsheet just now and how little they are represented. Yes, you have, for hunters on the arc side, you've got Disorient Blow and Lethal Current can give you kind of direct arc blindness. Titans have Seismic Strike, which have blindness on hit. And then for all the classes, you've got Flashbang, you've got Spark of Beacons, Spark of Brilliance, and weirdly Touch of Malice, which gives you arc blind. But the Queensbreaker doesn't. Grand Overture doesn't. But I'm not here to lament at the fact that there's those things aren't synergized. I think the implication is that a lot of those things are eventually going to get some sort of treatment for those sandboxes. And for the Void sandbox with Suppression, again, it's a similar kind of vibe here where you don't have a lot of access. When you do, it's strictly really to do with an exotic weapon. Collective Obligations, the Void weapons, that doesn't really count. But Trapped Cannon, Two-Tailed Fox, and Wave Splitter have suppression abilities. But like what you were saying there, Impetus, about a weapon perk, yes, it would need to be really heavily balanced for the PvP sandbox. But an Arc Blind and a Void Suppression perk would be really powerful. Because of their utility when it comes to, they don't affect champions and bosses. You can apply their effects and still get their synergies, but it doesn't really do anything to those type of combatants. But for mini bosses and for if you've got any high value targets which aren't champions or bosses, being able to blind and or I should say suppress them would be this is my go-to weapon perk, just because of the utility. And I'm looking at the list here for suppression. For hunters, Tether is really the only way to get suppression. Bombardiers does give you a quote light suppression effect. Again, Titans have got Shield Bash for their suppression. Warlocks don't have access to suppression directly, with the exception of all other classes having access to suppression grenades, tractor cannon, two-tailed fox, wave splitter, cellular suppression, and flash counter. So I would really like to see those type of perks for legendary weapons, but I completely acknowledge, Chris and Vivian said that it would be very tricky to balance.
Yeah. One day.
Yeah. On this kind of similar notes here of the different elements and their weapons and exotics that they do or don't function with. There's a bunch of different questions. Somebody brought up 1,000 voices, and Chris said that they have been messing around with it, but there's nothing really specific that they have planned to do at the time. But they are messing with like 25 exotics or something like that. And that they also said that they don't feel like sometimes it makes sense, like very thematic for what the weapon is doing. Like, I'm thinking 1KV, like if you hit all the stacks, it ignites, like each bullet would be like 1 point of Scorch or something like that. And that makes a lot of sense. But they also said not every elemental exotic for every match necessarily has to be tied in for the 3.0, because hot this week, but I'm pretty sure he said Telesto, is like, okay, Telesto's fine. It's doing its own thing. It's very unique. It does, pretty good damage. It has an interesting function with its explosion over time. Telesto does not need a Void 3.0 tie-in, right? And I think that holds up true versus like some other exotics that feel like they could use it much more, not only from like a thematic sense, but also just from like a power sense. One that comes to mind specifically has been mentioned a while is like Two-Tailed Fox, right? And has these 2 rockets, and they're not quite functioning fully with their like elemental potential, and maybe that could help them a little bit, or help that exotic a little bit move up just in the overall meta. Any thoughts on the exotics?
Two-Tailed Fox is this really weird outlier. The Void Rocket does suppress, and it's a full suppression as well. It's not like a light one, but the solar rocket is just an old burn. And as you were saying, Vivian did mention that the weapons team do agree that they should grandfather, kind of deprecate the old sandbox verbs, at least from their perspective of the weapons team. There is a lot of cooperation between various different teams here. Sandbox team having the bulk of the sort of job here when it comes to, getting rid of old types of sandbox verbs. I completely agree with their sentiment with, not every weapon should have a element attached to it, a sandbox element like Scorch or Suppression. I'm looking down the list here. Like, does Cloud Strike need Jolt? Is that its own
absolutely.
thing? Okay. Okay, wrong example. Does Devil's Ruin, does that need Scorch with the laser? Is that a Scorch dealing laser, or is it just a laser? It just so happens to be solar.
I would still say yes in that case. The one that I think of is Duality. Duality does not need to tie into any of the solar ones, right? It's just it's a shotgun that happens to be solar. It's perfectly fine without any tie-in to the solar ability sandbox. It does its job perfectly fine. It doesn't need any specific tie-in for it to matter in PvP. It's still a fantastic option.
Here's one that I've seen a lot of suggestions when it comes to hard light or any weapon that you can swap elements, Arc, Solar, and Void. Do you think those weapons should have sandbox perks attached to them? So if you swap to Solar, you'd get some like 1 Scorch per ricochet or something like that. Or do you think those weapons, they're tied to, the whole gimmick is that you can swap the elements. That's the gimmick. It doesn't get to have all these fancy sandbox perks.
I would say no. I think the ability to match any shield in the game, any light-based shield in the game, because that may change at some point in the future, is enough of an exotic feel for me. I feel like, especially hard light with the infinite ammo, if I could suddenly tie into any one subclass verb at any time just by holding down that reload button, would definitely, again, throw off the power balance in a pretty big ways. Dead Messenger would be just an absolute nightmare in PvP if I could swap to different verbs. And I mean, I think Borealis would certainly come up as a result of that change, but I don't know. I feel I'm hesitant to just be like, yes, that should be a thing. It would have to be very situational. Sam, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I could regurgitate some thoughts here that have been covered, but I think you guys have communicated pretty clearly. I like the tie-ins. Not everything doesn't have to tie in, and it's okay, right? It doesn't need to be super close, but it definitely, like the one that I brought up on the interview was like the burn versus scorch, because that's like the most confusing thing out of everything, right? And I think that if some of that is tuned in, like the overshield stuff that we talked about for a minute, there's like overshields, and then there's like void overshields, and doesn't, like, Divinity applies a debuff, but it's an arc gun, and shouldn't that be void? And there's some things that they're like, it's just too old and too set in the way that it is, that we just don't need to mess with it, and then that's okay. And like Divinity can be arc and be a debuff gun, and it doesn't all have to be super thematic. But I think this is probably like a kind of moving forward, these 3.0 design principles we'll probably kind of see much more consistently as we develop new weapons now that this is like in the game. So I'm not expecting Divinity to be turned into a void weapon, but I am expecting that like new exotics that we get have like either fit the themes of the weapon for like the verbs that they use, or are like the correct element for whatever that is, even if they have no tie-in to like the specific subclass verbs or anything like that.
Yeah, I think they mentioned 1,000 Voices and how that's going to get some solar treatment. We don't know what exactly is going to happen there, but I think the implication, we can make the theory that when you fire the beam, it's going to add stacks of Scorch, or something along those lines. It's going to make an ignition at some point, or many ignitions. And I think that would be really, like, for 1,000 Voices, which has fallen behind in times. It used to be the big bad boy when it came to damage. It's been replaced by various other things. But I don't necessarily think 1,000 Voices should come back up to the top of the damage pyramid. But having solar utility, and you can synergize it with all those little aspects and fragments on the solar subclass for each, Hunter, Titan, and Warlock, and really spec into that. And I think that's what that needs. I know we're talking about Elemental Sandbox Perks here, but, very recently we had Thunderlord, which doesn't have access to, arc stuff. It's its own thing. But a small buff, like giving it overload capability, has just made it from, 0 to hero. And that's what I think is going to happen to 1,000 Voices. And the same with, like...
And that Catalyst, man.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, Catalyst, of course, yeah. And, like, we've mentioned Sunshot many times before on this podcast, and hopefully it gets some sort of treatment in the future just to spec into the solar sandbox. It doesn't need too much, because it is still a reasonably good weapon. But, fairly recently with Kingsfall bringing out a particular hand cannon with the explosive shot and incandescent, just kind of was like, oh, right, okay. It's, all right.
It's like that, huh?
Now I'm sad. But yeah, no, I think the overarching point here is that, yes, of course, every weapon doesn't need to have its own, reach into its respective elemental sandbox, but there are some weapons that I think would just to elevate them into a nice, respectful position. They don't need to be the massive, linear fusion rifle meta that we're currently living in right now, but it would just give them a nice little edge. And the way I see it with these subclass verbs, and just synergizing with your subclasses. I really love build crafting into that. And, you guys have heard me talk about all my various elemental builds on this on this podcast, and the various different builds that I've posted up on the Discord, and I've got more in the pipeline as well, just because of that aspect of build crafting, thanks to all these weapons that can have that access to it.
Do you you have a kinetic build in the pipeline there, Court?
Well, depends what they're going to do.
Sorry, I'm jumping the gun a bit, but been looking at this question in the comments and crack me up.
I was just going to say one response I wanted to shout out was at the very end. We were talking about kind of where do you just start designing an exotic from, and where do those all come from? And Vivian said that there's two basically ways this can go. They can identify some kind of vacancy or a issue that they want to fix, and then kind of design from there. Or they will start off with some kind of fantasy mechanic or flavor of weapon or a design of it, and then go down into figuring out how to make that work. So I really love the idea that sometimes like an exotic weapon could start from somebody gets there's a new feature or tool in the game, or sometimes it just starts because somebody has this weapon model and something from the lore, right, that they really want to get in here, and they kind of try to figure out where it can go from there. But yeah, fluidity is very cool.
All right. Anything else we want to say, or do we want to move on to the most important topic, what's happening to the kinetic damage type?
Yeah, let's talk about the star of the slot.
Let's hear about kinetics.
Turns out they're not supposed to have. Yeah, turns out they're not supposed to have arc rockets. That is a bug.
I cannot financially recover from this.
Yeah, this is actually, this is probably outside of Strand, this is the element that I'm most looking forward to. As, Vivian said, we want it to be a proper valid damage type for weapons. I'm not seeing it right now. I'll tell you what, with the number of match game activities that we have, it does not feel that way. Arbalest is just far and away so strong because it can ignore the match game modifier. We've gotten the adaptive munitions perk that's showing up on a lot of elemental weapons, but it has yet to show up on most kinetic slot weapons outside of stasis ones. And I don't, I think it would have been a really, really cool move to have adaptive munitions only show up on kinetic weapons. I think that would have definitely brought a lot of kinetic weapons into my loadout more frequently, but that's not how things played out, so there's no point on speculating. But it needs work, and we don't have kinetic shields. We've only got the one kinetic fusion rifle. It's an exotic. It functions differently from all the other fusion rifles in the game. There's a lot of gray areas. Quicksilver Storm had a lot of interesting ideas going for it. Arc damage aside, I still like the alt fire modes. I think that can be very exciting. But again, it's an exotic. We want to focus on the legendaries because those are the ones that are really lagging behind now that we're getting these elemental perks, spicing up the energy slot counterparts here. We're looking forward to what happens, but I'm not so worried about kinetic exotics because I think those can be very easily adapted into very niche options, and it doesn't look like they're running out of ideas. We've had Outbreak Perfected, has a really strong fantasy for a primary weapon in particular. Wither Horde, of course, hugely popular. The Quicksilver Storm, Arbalest getting that glow up. On the primary side, we've got Wishender suddenly becoming a fantastic option just by slapping on anti-barrier, being able to pierce through all those shields quite quickly, even easily when you got that fully drawn arrow knocked. But I'm more worried about the legendaries. How do you make a proper valid damage type for legendary weapons when it doesn't tie in? You can't tie into an ability sandbox the same way that all our Void, Solar, Stasis, presumably Strand, and Arc weapons can. It's gonna be tough. I don't know. That's the thing. Do you just go the route of they hit harder? Because that is how it is right now. But do you just double down on that without? I don't know how you do that without increasing the.
What's the percentage on that right now? It's pretty low, right?
It's 5%.
Yeah.
To an unshielded combatant. So if they are shielded, you are doing reduced damage because it's kinetic against a elemental shield. If you used a non-matching elemental weapon, then yeah, you'd have a much easier time. But a lot of activities have match game on, so you are very, your hands are tied if you try and go up against a wizard who likes to dart around. It's got that solar shield, and you only have, I don't know, you've only got a pulse rifle. Like it's difficult. So how do you balance around that? Yeah, I think shields still have a place, but that 5% when they're unshielded, it's not a lot. It's nothing, and you get
Now,
much
if
better.
they double that, do you guys think that's a consideration?
10%?
Yeah.
Still quite low.
Not enough still? Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It's just it is interesting to see what could they even do with it, right?
This is an interesting balance because, we have really strong exotics, as Impetus mentioned there. I'd like to also mention Osteostriga. It's that whole poison damage is its own gimmick. But these are exotic weapons. These are the exception to the rule. So when you balance or when you buff kinetics to have, like, let's say 25% damage increase against a non-shielded combatant, Outbreak Perfected and Osteostriga would also get that. It's like, why would you ever use a non-exotic kinetic weapon? This is going to be very interesting how they balance and how they approach this problem. Because we're all talking about and our joy and positivity towards Elemental Sandbox Perks, but kinetics are just lagging behind, and it's just became more and more obvious with all these fancy, suppression and repulsor brace and cold steel, and it's just it's really. I'm really interested in this particular topic. Out of all the topics that were discussed in this Q&A, this was maybe my second or third top question and answer that we got, because it's a very glaring and obvious problem in the current sandbox.
Yeah, they're in such a, they've kind of backed themselves into a corner, right? It's just Kinetic it's known as doing damage and being a hard hitting weapon, even though it's such a tiny percentage. And yeah, there's still plenty of activities in the game where that's we don't have match game. You can do any raid without having to worry about match game, right? That base difficulty, not a modifier. You're welcome to bring in kinetics; they'll do just fine. Same thing for dungeons. But when you start tallying up the amount of activities that have match game, I mean, Gambit, for goodness sakes, has a very weak version of match game active. It's not the full-on modifier, but it is present there. Just go fire any kinetic weapon at some of those shields in Gambit. You'll absolutely feel it because you're not going to be doing a lot to those shields. That to me says okay, well, either we get rid of that for Gambit or we really, really crank up the damage for kinetic weapons so that it does matter. Because right now, especially those primaries, the kinetic primaries, they're not doing it. And if you want to have tools in your toolbox for all types of situations, do you need a kinetic primary? Seriously, do you need a kinetic primary? It's nice to have. There's some great options. I'm not denying it. I love my Time Lost Fatebringer, but I'm not going to ever take it into a GM. I'm just not. There's no place for it right now.
That's a great example because I'm I got that Fatebringer with that you're just talking about with explosive payload and frenzy, right? And that thing is just an absolute favorite weapon, and it's so strong. And I haven't used it in a single GM. It's multiple seasons, and yeah. It's a good case point right there.
I mean, just a direct question to both of you. I'll also answer this at the start here as well. But what is your go-to kinetic primary weapon? For me, the last time I extensively used a kinetic weapon is probably Extraordinary Rendition, which is your SMG from many, many seasons ago. I've got Submission as well. That is still a really solid weapon to go to. But outside of those weapons, what are you taking into to a raid or a dungeon or like anything that's got match game activities?
I gotta check Dim because I can't even pull something out of the top of my head here.
I would say that submission is such a strong one because it's like it has good perks and it has an incredibly strong origin trait, right? And that is like, well, the only thing that keeps me coming back to submission, which I don't know how many. I think I have almost as many kills on my submission as I do on my Mida Mini tool, which is, I don't know. That puts that in good perspective of like I have used that an incredible amount. A crate is also a good weapon. I don't use it as much, but
that's stasis though. You can't compare that one. That's cheating.
Yep.
Oh, what?
Yeah,
that's right. Well, I guess then syncopation is out too.
Yep. Yeah, that's the problem. It's like that's stasis, that one's stasis. I think most of these roles that I'm looking at are like utility ones,
Accrued redemption. I used that a fair amount. The bow from Garden of Salvation. Yeah, that was the first precision. No, I don't know. I may be misspeaking here, but I think that was the first precision bow that I could get that was unsunset that had explosive payload and archer's tempo in the kinetic.
It's still the only one that can for precisions. The Biting Winds from Europa doesn't get archer's tempo, but you can get explosive head on that. And then we've got the Throne World one, which is a lightweight that gets archer's tempo and explosive payload. That's Felt Terradiddle. So it's still unique, and it's still, it's got great stats for precision, one of the best statted precision bows in the game. But, I would not take that over my Under Your Skin if I had to go in and solo Devil's Lair.
Oh, no chance.
No chance. Popping those void shields in the boss room is too big of a deal for me. I'm not,
Plus, lane tank is just better.
Yeah, the origin trait stuff is a whole other matter. But my Under Your Skin had Archer's Tempo, Explosive Head. That's the exact role I would want on Accrued Redemption, and I still wouldn't use it because there's a little void circle right next to Under Your Skin, and that matters more in a GM when I need to. When my weapons really matter, because I'm the only one going into it, yeah, I've just got all these. I've got like Demo Osmosis. I've got, my submission is level 40. I have a Blast Fire in it. It feels great. Same thing for my Fatebringer. They just feel phenomenal. I've got Duty Bound. It feels amazing with that stats for all 1-for-all combo. But there's just
Duty Bound is a good one because it can get Stunning Recovery, and Stunning Recovery is one hell of a origin trait, and I think that is the only thing. But again, the trend here is it either needs to have it can like completely stand out unique perk combination, or it needs an origin trait that is just S tier, or it's not happening pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've loaded up my dim and I'm looking at my, because I tend to keep weapons that I use quite a lot either on my main character or on my Warlock and Titan, just to kind of swiftly move back and forth whenever I fancy it. And there's a lot of exotics. Exotics, like Outbreak Perfected's here, Witherhoard's here, Quicksilver, which is like my go-to weapon right now, Izanagi's Burden. Like all these weapons are exceptions. Arbalest is top tier, of course. And then I'm looking at, all of my other weapons are stasis, or they're energy weapons like Grenade Launcher. It's got blinding grenades, or it's got Demo. The only couple ones that I see here that are just kinetic, they're not stasis or anything like that, is Smite of Meren from Kingsfall. Fatebringer's here. Submission, I mentioned that. Extraordinary Renditions over in my Titan. So I still use those weapons, but they are far and few between, weapons like Striga and like Monte Carlo. It's just that's like the glaring problem, because my go-to setup would be Quicksilver Storm with Forbearance and a linear fusion rifle. That's my kind of casual go-to for a bunch of activities, but there's not a lot of kinetic weapons here.
Yeah, Extraordinary Rendition is another one that remind me of weapons that I have used a lot, but still I haven't touched it since a lot of these other elemental SMGs started coming online, right?
Yeah. They all have osmosis. I'm just looking at all my Kinetic primaries. They're all utility weapons. Like my Servant Leader has osmosis. I've got a Judgment with osmosis. I've got an Escape Velocity. I think this is the one that Xur sold, that Overflow Osmosis roll. Like that, I've got like a long range one, a short range Osmosis roll, and a mid range Osmosis roll. And that's kind of it. Everything else is just like, well, this dropped from a raid. It has great stats. It feels fantastic to fire. Yeah, of course I'm going to hold on to it, and then it's all my stasis ones and then various PvP kinetics. That's it. That's all I've got.
Yeah, you mentioned Osmosis. Osmosis Frenzy is a Fatebringer that I have used an extensive amount, I should say.
And that's still the only weapon in the game to get Osmosis in the third column.
Yep. And I'm giving up Explosive Payload, which is like, God, dude, that's a tough sell, man. Any other questions that you guys want to hit on here before we wrap things up?
The two here, which were very interesting to hear their thoughts, was the exotic gun and armor interactions. So they talked about Lumina and Boots of Assembler. So those two synergize with each other. Thorn and Warlock's Poison Gloves. Necrotic Grips. Yep. So those are like the top examples for synergy between weapons and armor, which I feel like they gave us the answer of there's no direct plans anytime soon, but they are vigilant for opportunities. But I feel that's the next natural step to go for after they've really fleshed out Elemental Sandbox Perks like Incandescent and that. And the other one was, speaking of Lumina, was the more support weapons. And Chris did say that they have... They are very excited by the space for support weapons, and they do plan to devote more resources and time to exploring that in the future, particularly with subclass verbs, and he name-dropped Strand as well.
But not Kinetic, man. Come on, please give Kinetic support stuff. Seriously, you can't just have it only be damage. Like I'm gonna have better options,
So those two questions jumped up for me as really interesting insight. You guys got any more?
The Lumina one with Boots of Assembler, the fact that it was an armor designer wanted to incorporate an exotic weapon effect into an exotic armor piece, so the weapons team helped them get the Boots of the Assembler concept kind of up and running, was just fascinating to me. Like that's a really cool communication between two different areas of the sandbox, coming together to make that interaction work. And then, of course, the opposite side with Osteostriga, where it was somebody on the weapons team wanted to really play around with Necrotic Grip's functionality, but in weapon form. That gave me a lot of hope for the future of like, oh, I cannot wait to see what kind of crazy interactions come about with the future stuff. Particularly with Strand, like what we could see on both the weapon and armor side. Combining forces to make something that's absolutely crazy. That gives me a lot of excitement just thinking about all the different possibilities that could come aboard.
Yeah, I don't play a lot of Warlock in PvE, but I would love some kind of very like close rangey, like barricadey kind of Lumina Boots of the Assembler, support build like that, or if they expand on anything like that. All very cool. Very cool stuff. And to see like the cross-pollination of the fact that the armor designer was like, we want you to make this gun. And they were like, all right, sure. what's it going to do? Tell us about it.
I think that's a space that they could really exploit as support-based weapons, regardless if it's Kinetic or Strand or any other element. I think we need more of those. I suppose Divinity you could call a support weapon. And I'd like to see more, not just purely debuff wise, but more, weapons that give your team health. And we see that with the Warlock Glaive. I think that's a candidate that could be, this could be uplifted a little bit, and that healing turret could be a lot more useful. But that would be like a baseline. Like, here's where this is a support based weapon, and go from there. Exploiting all the subclass verbs.
Oh man, can you imagine if that worked with Boots of the Assembler? Whew.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep it real with you guys. I completely forgot about that.
It's okay. I forgot about it too.
I was like, oh, that's right, the healing turret.
I think everyone's kind of forgot about it.
Which is a shame because it's cool. You know, the idea of it is cool. At least, same thing for the gumdrop bubble for the Titan. But
hey, hopefully those weapons are they're the 3 of the 20, 25, 26, 27 getting a rework next season. Only time will tell.
That'd be great.
All right, let's see. I got to check these, see if there's anything else I wanted to touch on real quick here.
Yeah, I think I'm good. If you guys have anything else you want to hit on.
No, I think we had some really healthy discussion across the broad spectrum of the weapons sandbox, and we did get some really excellent insight into, Vivian's kind of speciality at the team is the cross between weapons and sandbox. I was really, really interested to get that perspective because, we only really look at weapons as a binary rather than as a dynamic between all these different sandboxes that work in Destiny. And it's really great to see that they're exploiting that. They're getting really more in depth with how weapons can jump into a solar verb or a stasis verb.
Yeah, I mean, touching on exotic weapons, I think, towards the end of the interview, we did get that quote from Chris about just how expensive exotic weapons are to make for the weapons team. Half a season, which he clarified was about 1.5 months to make. We were obviously pretty harsh on a lot of the solar exotic weapons when Solar 3.0 came out, and there was not a lot of tie-ins immediately there. But hearing him clarify that, yeah, they take all of them just take a long time to make. Definitely put things into perspective of, it would take a long time, maybe a whole season, even more, to get all of the exotics that have obvious elemental tie-ins to this upgraded ability 3.0 system. It just takes a long time. It's not that they don't want to do that or that they're not thinking about those things, but getting it from concept to in-game is something that is going to take many, many weeks. There's a lot of iteration. There's a lot of conversations happening outside of the weapons team. So I'm glad that we're finally getting a rework for a lot of these exotic weapons. They've been stressing just the large number of them that are coming next season. And I'm very excited to see those changes. But, I'm going to have that quote in the back of my head every time, we get an exotic weapon in the game. Like this took half a season to make. And even if it doesn't hit or land where I want it to land, it's not a hastily thought out project, right? There's a lot of people that took a look at this particular weapon before it came out. There were a lot of conversations, a lot of different play testing, and there's probably if I have a piece of criticism or a suggestion for it, it's probably pretty likely that somebody else already thought about that at Bungie, and there were probably reasons that I don't know about for why they went with the path that they did for a particular exotic weapon. So I think that was a really great clarification that Chris made, and I'm really happy that he was able to say that, because it put a lot of things into perspective for me and hopefully for a number of our listeners.
Generally speaking, we've been getting some real bangers of exotics recently. Recently, I say the last couple of years. I mean, I've mentioned Quicksilver Storm again so many times in this episode and previous episodes, but because it's a really solid weapon, it's like, it just feels good. And I know Chris, he did work on that specifically. So like, hats off to not just Chris, not just Vivian, but the entire weapons team, because they have been smashing it with a lot of weapons. Yeah, we have been fairly critical. We talked about the glaives there. They still haven't hit the mark, in my opinion anyway, all three of them. But yeah, as Impetus was saying there, hopefully some of these weapons that require just a little bit of housekeeping, a little bit of love and care, whether that's just a little bit of, catalyst love or subclass verb interaction. I do look forward to some of the reworks next season. Should also point out, it's 27 exotics are getting not just reworks, but some of them are getting buffs, big, small, but they are also mentioned that some are getting some nerfs, big and small. So it's not 27 overhauled. That would be lovely. That would be great to see 27 exotics getting a massive overhaul, but that's not feasible. So hopefully...
I'm expecting like a couple to get some kind of like functional change, and everything else is, perks changed or buffs and nerfs and things like that, right?
But the reworks have been bangers.
We'll see.
I mean, all the way through, right? Collective Obligation,
Yeah.
Look at the glow up that thing has had. I mean, my goodness.
Yeah,
Just
man,
notes. Thunderlord's
that was so
awesome,
good to see.
right?
I hate to see a raid exotic that's no good.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I've got
Hate
hope
to
for
see
1K because of Collective Obligations rework. I mean, they obviously want those raid exotics to really hit. So I'm excited for 1K. I have no doubt they'll smash it out of the park. Wishender, I mean, my goodness, that thing was like the forgotten exotic for, at the bottom of the usage charts. Now it has a really viable place. It's an anti-barrier weapon with infinite ammo. You can get those multiple damage pings because of how the exotic perk functions. It's a phenomenal option. Yes, Arbalist is overshadowing it right now, but still, if you have a really solid energy special weapon that you want to use, Wishender is phenomenal for piercing those shields, for piercing barrier champions, if you want to go into that kind of activity with barrier champions present. And I think I'm really, even though these are going to be minor changes coming up for a lot of these 27 exotic weapons next season, I'm still extremely, extremely excited for them because they've clearly shown that they're making all the right kinds of updates for these weapons.
To be honest, some of these exotics only need minor changes. Like, I just highlight Thunderlord again. Yeah, it got a catalyst on top of its overload, but those weren't massive overhaul to Thunderlord. Thunderlord's still got it's still the same as before. It's just got a little bit of treatment for overload champions, and it's got that catalyst for refreshing ammo. That's all it needed. It's went from 0 to hero. So yeah, I completely echo what you said there, Impetus, about 1K. It just needs just a small kind of, apply Scorch, and there you go. You've got synergy with the rest of your solar subclass.
All right. Well, that is episode 40. Thanks for listening in. It has been great to be back this week after just hectic a couple weeks and a month, honestly. Thank you for listening in, and we want to thank our audio engineer, MisterSudden, for keeping us sounding great each and every episode, putting the shows together. It is always appreciated. My name is Saint Kabir. You can find me by Saint_Kabir on Twitter, YouTube, Discord, running around on Nessus. Impetus, where can listeners find you?
My name is Impetus. You can find me by that name on Discord and in Destiny, and as Impetus always on Twitter for however long that platform continues to exist. Court, where can we find you?
Yes, if that platform does keep existing, you can find me as at Court Projects. Alternatively, over on Discord, where you'll find me on the Massive Breakdowns Discord server as Court, and you can find my various documentation along with other community-led documentation applications and various other things to enhance your Destiny experience over on the Destiny Massive Breakdowns website. All right, that is an episode for this week. Thank you very much for listening. We will see you in a few weeks' time.